Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 323. And this time, let's talk about Quincy Jones, and specifically Quincy Jones's record from 1962 on Impulse, his only release on Impulse, the Quintessence. This is an original 1962 mono pressing, which sounds pretty good. As you can see, this used to belong to a W.J. Pettaway of 32 Granger Street in Waterbury, Connecticut. It has this tremendous Pete Turner picture on it, one of the great Pete Turner record cover photos, in my view. Quincy Jones, of course, has had an enormously varied career and a very long career in the music industry, a very storied and much heralded career. This is early in his career. He is making his way as a musician, as a composer, as an arranger, as a band leader, but already kind of more than that, somebody who had the vision and the personality to bring projects together. But he's still fundamentally a musician here as opposed to a player, and he's still fundamentally a jazz musician, a big band jazz musician. And this is very much a big band record. It's crisp, it's bluesy, it's energetic, and it reflects the pop sensibility of both Jones as a writer and arranger, but also of Bob Thiele, his pop sensibility as a producer. Quincy Jones Jr. was born on the south side of Chicago in March 1933. His dad was from Kentucky. The family had moved north during the Great Migration during the Jim Crow era in the 1930s. His primary musical influences as a child were both his mother's like of gospel music and also the stride piano playing of the lady who lived next door, and it was on her piano that he first learned to play. However, his childhood was pretty hard. His mom was schizophrenic. She ended up being institutionalized. Dad married somebody else, and they moved together with Quincy and his brother and her children to the Seattle area in the middle of World War II, where his dad got work as a carpenter for the Navy. Quincy goes to Garfield High School in Seattle, which is where his formal musical training really starts to take off. He learns the trumpet. He also learns the rudiments of arranging. As a teenager, he began gigging regularly in the Seattle area. And in 1947, at the Black Elks Club, he met another young musician, a few years older than him, who was touring from the South, a piano player and a singer by the name of Ray Charles. And they really hit it off, and they struck up a friendship and a regular collaboration which endured for decades and decades. After high school in 1951, Quincy goes off to Seattle University on a music scholarship, but he soon transfers to the Berklee College of Music in Boston the same year. In Boston, as well as his studies, he fell in with a band leader called Preston Sandiford, who had a regular gig with his band at an outfit called Izzy Ort's Bar and Grill. And it was at Izzy Ort's Bar and Grill that young Quincy began to attract the attention of traveling musicians that would come through, in particular Lionel Hampton. In 1953, Hampton persuades Quincy to leave Berklee and leave Boston and come and join him on a tour of Europe. And that first tour of Europe for Quincy Jones, as it was for many young Black American musicians, was a real eye-opener in the way that people were treated differently than they'd been treated in the US. On that trip, he also made his recording debut as a leader on a record called Quincy Jones Swedish American All-Stars, which was a 10-inch EP made in Sweden, which features a young Art Farmer on trumpet. And while Quincy's own trumpet playing was pretty good, Lionel Hampton could soon see that his real calling was in writing and arranging. And sure enough, Quincy began to get more and more offers to come to New York City to do precisely that, work on sessions, writing and arranging with pretty major stars. He was working with Sarah Vaughan, he was working with Count Basie, he was working with Duke Ellington, and with his old friend from teenage years, Ray Charles. In the mid-1950s, Quincy got work playing trumpet for CBS TV productions in New York, and his trumpet could be heard in the first half dozen network TV performances by Elvis Presley. He was now mixing with the musical elite. In 1956, he becomes the musical director for Dizzy Gillespie, and he goes on some of the very first U.S. State Department-funded global cultural tours. And around this time, his recording career really starts to take off in earnest. He signs with ABC Paramount, who would eventually be the parent company for Impulse Records, and he puts out two records in 1957, This Is How I Feel About Jazz and Go West Man. Around this time, he also does some fairly influential work with Ray Charles during Ray Charles's last couple of years with Atlantic Records. Fascinated by European life, Quincy then goes back to Europe. He moves to Paris, where he studies under Nadia Boulanger, who had been the mentor for people like Leonard Bernstein. He also gets a gig as a music director for Barclay Records, which was a major label in France, and also Mercury Records licensee in France. And there he produces people like Charles Aznavour, Jacques Brel, as well as visiting Americans like Sarah Vaughan. The phone at this point never stops ringing with new and interesting projects. And in 1958, Quincy is asked to help revive or revamp a musical, a so-called blues opera by Harold Arlen called Free and Easy. Jones throws himself into this project, which is fascinating. His brief is to update the jazz elements of this musical. And pretty soon the thing is revamped, they're ready to tour, and they take this musical with an 18-piece orchestra, which Jones calls the Jones Boys, off on a tour of North America and Europe. They get rave reviews in Europe, but they make no money, partly because they've got an 18-piece orchestra they've got to feed. They're not packing out the houses and so on. And eventually the whole thing collapses and Jones takes a big financial bath. Mercury Records at this point can see he's in trouble, know his potential and how skilled he is, and so they rescue him. He gets a personal loan from the president, and they bring him back to New York, and they make him musical director of their New York operations. Then in 1961, they promote him to vice president of Mercury, and now his career is really starting to lift off. He's still making his own records. He's also producing and arranging for other people, but he's also starting to write film scores, and this was the route which would lead to him moving to LA in just a few years and would eventually, by the end of the 1960s, make him a very rich guy and a very influential guy. This was also the time when Impulse Records had just been launched, and although he hadn't released a record on Impulse yet, Jones was quite influential in the early years of the label, particularly because he had been very instrumental in the arrangements and the overall delivery of probably Creed Taylor's first real statement record, which was Ray Charles's Genius plus Soul equals Jazz. Bob Thiele was looking for mainstream big name jazz players to counterbalance the more avant garde stuff that Impulse was also releasing to keep the accountants happy. And so Quincy Jones in late 1961 fits the bill perfectly for Impulse. This record was made on 3 different dates in late 1961 with changes in personnel each time. The venue for the recordings was Capitol Records Studio A on West 46. The producer is Bob Thiele. The writer of some of the music and the arranger of all of it and the conductor is Quincy Jones. There are 33 musicians on here, although only 3 were actually present for all the sessions. Those are Phil Woods on alto, Billy Byers on trombone, and Julius Watkins on French horn. Others who feature on many of the tracks include the reed player Oliver Nelson, Snooky Young and Thad Jones on trumpet, Patricia Bone on piano, and Milt Hinton on bass. There are also some cameos from people like Curtis Fuller, Clark Terry, and Freddie Hubbard. November 29, 1961 saw Jones complete the recordings for Lena and Lenny, and The Twitch and the other 6 tracks were all completed in the week before Christmas. Side 1 starts with the title track, The Quintessence, which, as the name would suggest, really kind of encapsulates everything which is good about Jones's arrangements, and in particular, Phil Woods on alto is excellent all the way through this track. Next is Robot Portrait by Billy Byers, who was Jones's collaborator on that blues opera project. It features Oliver Nelson on tenor and Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. It takes a little while to get to the solos, a little too long for my taste, but when you do get there, they're excellent. Next is Little Karen, which is written by Benny Golson, that East Coast hard bopper with a West Coast sensibility. The final track on side 1 is Monk's Straight No Chaser. They just roar through this. Milt Hinton's bass provides most of the energy, the drive behind it, and Joe Newman offers this very quirky little trumpet solo. Side 2 begins with For Lena and Lenny, which is written for Lena Horne and her husband Lenny Hayton. This is a glorious blues. It may be my favorite track on the record, and Bobby Scott's piano is just terrific in playing off both the brass and the reed sections. Next is Jones's Hard Sock Dance, which has a nice little trumpet duel between Thad Jones and Freddie Hubbard. Next we have Bronislaw Kaper's Invitation, which is probably the most distinctive composition and arrangement on the record. It's got a bit of a film noir feel and a very pleasing solo from what I think is Julius Watkins on French horn. The final track on the record is The Twitch, which is probably at the same time the swingingest and the mellowest track on the whole record, and the highlight is a nice little muted solo by Joe Newman. This isn't a long record. It has a running time of about half an hour, but it is chock full of all the things that you could just tell people in the music industry could see in Quincy Jones. Variety, dynamics, clever arrangements, and imaginative use of the full palette of a big band. It's not what you'd call relaxing music. It's really quite a high energy record. It's got some really interesting cameos from a number of great players. And while you can tell that Jones's best work is still probably in the future, it shows exactly what he was capable of in this genre. It's another great sounding and really nicely packaged record from Impulse. And for me, it's 4 to 5 stars.